This dying horse was delivered to the wrong ranch, but what he awakened there changed every life forever. He arrived in the middle of a winter storm, skin over bone, eyes emptied of life. A shipping mistake, they said, but when this broken horse stepped onto the wrong ranch, something extraordinary happened. Within days, he would uncover buried wounds, stir forgotten memories, and change a group of veterans in ways no one could have imagined. The wind came low across the Wyoming basin that afternoon, dragging long ribbons of dust behind the livestock trailer as it rattled up the lonely road toward Red Willow Resilience Ranch. The land was still locked in late winter colors, muted gold, pale sage, and the hard blue of a sky stretched thin. Nora Caldwell stood outside the barn with her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn canvas jacket, watching the trailer crawl closer. She wasn't expecting a delivery, and no one in their right mind would ship a horse out here without calling ahead. The ranch barely had enough funding to keep the current programs running. Yet the truck kept coming, coughing dark exhaust into the cold. When it finally lurched to a stop, the driver, Joe Miller, climbed out with a frown etched deep enough to hold dust. "Delivery for High Ridge Equestrian Facility," he said, tapping a clipboard as if the paperwork alone could force reality to match. Nora raised an eyebrow. High Ridge was nearly 30 miles south. Out here, a wrong turn meant hours wasted, sometimes more. GPS signals cut out often. Roads forked and vanished. Joe shrugged, defeated. "Signal died back there. This is the only ranch for miles." Nora stepped closer as he unlatched the back doors. A cold smell pushed outward, a mix of sweat, ammonia, and something heavier, like fear left too long in the dark. The horse inside didn't move at first. Only his breath showed he was alive, wafting in thin clouds from a body so gaunt it seemed carved from shadows. His coat, once perhaps a gray-white sheen, had dulled into something brittle. His ribs stood out like a ladder under skin, and his legs trembled beneath him as if each joint argued against bearing weight. When Joe coaxed him down the ramp, the horse's hooves slipped slightly, then settled into the frozen dirt. Nora felt her breath hitch as his face lifted toward her. Those eyes, hollow, distant, unblinking, were not the eyes of a skittish or mistreated horse. They were the eyes of a being who had stepped away from the world long before his body had followed. She had seen that same look in medevac tents years ago, in soldiers staring past her as she tried to keep them tethered to life. It hit her in the chest with a cold, old ache. "This horse isn't meant for me," she murmured. Joe handed her the paperwork anyway, shaking his head. "Lady, he's barely standing. If I haul him another hour, he won't make it." Someone mixed up the addresses. Doesn't matter who. What matters is, he's your problem now. It was an unfair thing to say, yet Nora understood the truth behind it. A sick animal on the edge of collapse didn't have time for bureaucracy. Red Willow specialized in equine therapy, mental health recovery, veteran support programs, and trauma stabilization. But they weren't equipped for this level of emergency. Still, when the horse leaned slightly toward her, as if gravity had chosen her specifically, the decision was made. She looped a trembling lead rope gently in her hand. "Easy, boy," she whispered. He didn't seem to hear, but he followed anyway, each step stiff and deliberate. Inside the barn, warm lamplight brushed across his sunken frame, revealing rub marks along his muzzle. Injuries that looked like the aftermath of harsh endurance training. Nora exhaled slowly. Whoever owned him had pushed him to the edge, and perhaps past it. She settled him into an empty stall layered with fresh straw. He stood without lowering his head, as if resting required permission he no longer believed he deserved. The air around him felt strangely muted. Even the other horses in the barn, usually curious, stayed quiet, their ears flicking nervously toward his stall. Something about this creature drew stillness like a tide. "What's his name?" Reed Barnes asked from the doorway. Nora looked down at the form attached to the clipboard. Hawthorne. The name settled in the air with surprising weight. Reed stepped closer, studying the horse's rigid posture. "He looks gone," Reed said quietly. He didn't mean physically. Nora could hear it in his voice. Reed recognized the emptiness because he carried a version of it himself. Nora nodded, her throat tightening. "We'll do what we can tonight. Vitals, hydration, slow refeeding. Tomorrow we call High Ridge and sort out the mix-up." She turned back toward Hawthorne, whose gaze had drifted past all of them, lingering somewhere unreachable. As Nora reached to stroke his neck, Hawthorne didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge her at all. He simply existed, like a ghost trapped in a body too fragile to hold him. The barn lights hummed softly overhead, casting long shadows across the straw as the wind beat against the siding in steady, muted thumps. Nora whispered, "You weren't meant to arrive here." She wasn't sure why she said it aloud, but in the cold stillness of the stall, something in her sensed the truth beneath the mistake. This horse had not stumbled into their lives by accident. And as Hawthorne shifted his weight, barely perceptible but there, a quiet certainty formed in her chest. He had come here for a reason. Nora backed away slowly, closing the stall door behind her, unaware that this fragile stranger would soon unravel secrets none of them were prepared to face, and change Red Willow Ranch forever. Dawn came quietly to Red Willow Ranch, brushing pale light across the frost-hardened ground and the worn buildings that had long stood as both refuge and reminder. Nora moved through the barn with slow, practiced steps, her breath rising in small clouds as she checked each stall. When she reached Hawthorne, he was standing exactly where she had left him the night before, as if time had passed around him rather than through him. His eyes tracked nothing, not even the drifting dust motes catching the first light. Eyes that seemed to absorb light instead of reflect it. But the ranch was waking, and his presence was already unsettling the fragile balance the veterans worked so hard to maintain. Reed Barnes was the first to appear, shoulders tense beneath his flannel shirt. He approached only far enough to see into the stall, then stopped, jaw tightening. "Did he move at all?" he asked. Nora shook her head. Reed nodded, though the answer clearly troubled him. Reed didn't fear the horse. He feared what the horse reminded him of. Some wounds didn't bleed, but they hollowed a man the same way. Tessa Monroe arrived next, clutching a mug of coffee, her shaggy brown hair still damp from a shower. She paused mid-sip when she saw Hawthorne. The mug lowered slowly. "He looks like he hasn't slept in months," she whispered. Nora didn't correct her. Hawthorne wasn't restless. He was detached, as if sleep and wakefulness were no longer concepts he participated in. Tessa's breath hitched the way it sometimes did when the echo of rotor blades rushed through memory. She turned away, grounding herself in the steady ritual of sweeping the barn aisle. Dylan Shaw came last, his gait uneven but determined. His metal crutch clicked softly across the floor as he approached, the rhythm a familiar part of mornings here. He leaned against the stall rail, studying Hawthorne with thoughtful eyes. "You ever seen a horse shut down like that?" Nora asked him. Dylan shook his head. "Not like this. He's breathing, but that's about it." A gust of cold swept through the barn as the heater kicked on, stirring hay and the faint smell of liniment. The ranch had always been a place held together with patched fences and goodwill, surviving on small donations, occasional grants, and the resilience of the people who needed it most. They had trauma sessions, equine therapy programs, mental health support, search engine keywords like Veterans Mental Health Services, PTSD support programs, and equine therapy for trauma recovery drifted through Nora's mind, not as marketing tools, but as lifelines she repeated to justify the ranch's existence in grant proposals. Still, nothing in her experience or training had prepared her for a horse whose spirit seemed absent long before his body had arrived. As the morning unfolded, each veteran tried in small, cautious ways to engage with Hawthorne. Reed paused near the stall during his chore route, his hands resting against the pitchfork handle. Hawthorne didn't turn toward him, but Reed lingered, anyway, drawn by something he couldn't articulate. Tessa stepped forward once, intending to greet him, but her hand froze mid-air when the barn door slammed accidentally, sending a tremor through the horse's muscles that mirrored her own. Dillon, ever patient, murmured a gentle greeting when he passed by, but Hawthorne remained utterly still. "He's not sick the way animals usually get sick," Dillon said later as he and Nora filled water buckets. "It's like he's empty." Nora nodded slowly. "And emptiness is harder to heal." Outside, a cold wind scraped across the ranch, rattling the wind chimes hanging near the porch. Sound traveled differently in Wyoming, clearer, sharper. It made quiet places feel even quieter, and Red Willow Ranch was already heavy with unspoken things. The veterans worked alongside one another, but carried their memories like shadow companions. Some days they found relief in small victories. A night with fewer nightmares, a moment of laughter, the warmth of a horse leaning against them. Other days, silence settled so thickly it felt like another presence in the room. By midday, Nora had made calls to High Ridge Equestrian Facility, leaving messages with increasingly urgent tones. No one picked up. The mix-up needed fixing, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that removing Hawthorne abruptly might do more harm than good. She replayed the moment his weight leaned toward her the night before, that faint, fragile pull of trust, or desperation. She wasn't sure which. When the sun dipped low again, painting long shadows across the snow-dusted fields, Nora returned to Hawthorne's stall with a fresh blanket. As she draped it over his back, she noticed a tiny shift, a flick of an ear, a small tremor beneath the skin. Barely there, but undeniably real. She stepped back, breath caught. Reed, passing by, noticed too. "Did he just respond?" "Maybe," Nora said softly. "Or maybe the wind startled him." But she didn't believe that. And neither did Reed. For the first time since his arrival, Hawthorne blinked, slow, heavy, like a door creaking open after years of being stuck. The ranch fell into a brief hush, as if the building itself held its breath. It wasn't a connection, not yet, but it was something, a fracture in the numbness that had wrapped itself around him like ice. Nora closed the stall door gently behind her, a sense of unease and anticipation stirring under her ribs. Hawthorne had taken a step, however small, toward the living. She just didn't know yet that this single blink would unravel every certainty the ranch had held until now. The next morning rose behind a veil of thin clouds, spreading a soft gray glow over Red Willow Ranch. The air held a brittle stillness, the kind that made sound travel farther and linger longer. Nora made her usual rounds, but her steps slowed as she approached Hawthorne's stall. Something had changed, quietly, subtly, but enough to draw her attention like a shift in air pressure. The horse wasn't in the same rigid posture as before. His head hung lower, not in defeat, but in a fragile, searching way, as though he was listening for something he wasn't sure he remembered. Reed Barnes arrived earlier than usual. He hadn't slept well, though for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Something about Hawthorne's faint blink the day before had stayed with him, an echo of life returning, the kind he recognized in himself after long months of numbness. He moved toward the stall cautiously, hands loose at his sides, unsure what he expected to find. Hawthorne didn't turn his head, but Reed noticed a small tremor ripple along the horse's shoulder as he drew near. It wasn't fear, Reed realized. It was awareness. He stepped close enough for Hawthorne to sense his presence and exhaled slowly, a grounding exercise from therapy he rarely used outside the safety of sessions. "Hey, bud," Reed murmured, voice low and steady, "just passing through." Then something unexpected happened. Hawthorne shifted his weight, ever so slightly, as if leaning, not away, but toward the warmth of Reed's voice. It wasn't a gesture most would notice, but Reed felt it like a hand pressed gently against his chest. Nora, watching from the aisle, caught the moment and nearly held her breath. She'd seen traumatized horses come back from the brink before, but never so soon, never so selectively. Reed seemed unaware of the significance, but she saw the fragile thread forming between them, a thread that might one day carry the weight of healing. Later, as Tessa Monroe finished sweeping the aisle, she paused outside Hawthorne's stall. She hesitated, then extended a tentative hand. Not to touch him, just to offer the possibility. Tessa's fingers trembled faintly, the remnants of old memories flashing like static at the edges of her thoughts. Hawthorne didn't respond at first, but as Tessa murmured something soft, barely audible, he lifted his head, nostrils flaring to catch her scent. His ears flicked forward, the smallest sign of curiosity, yet it struck Tessa like a warm current pushing through cold water. Her breath steadied, shoulders lowering for the first time that morning. Dylan Shaw wandered over mid-afternoon, propping himself against the stall door. Sunlight spilled through a high window, turning dust particles into drifting sparks around him. "You're doing better than I expected," Dylan said gently, the words intended as both observation and encouragement. Hawthorne took a half-step forward, eyes scanning Dylan's movements. When Dylan shifted his crutch, adjusting his balance, the horse mirrored him unconsciously, matching the slow, uneven rhythm of his stance. Nora blinked in astonishment. Horses often mirrored humans in subtle ways, but doing so with a stranger, especially in Hawthorne's state, was unheard of. "He's reading you," she said quietly. Dylan frowned, confused, until he realized Hawthorne had aligned himself perfectly, almost protectively, with his posture. By early evening, a quiet buzz settled over the ranch. Not excitement, something deeper, a sense of watching a dormant seed finally crack open beneath snow. No one said it aloud, but all three veterans felt their own guarded spaces shift whenever they lingered near Hawthorne. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic, just a series of soft, unmistakable moments that gathered like pebbles accumulating into a cairn. As Nora closed the barn for the night, she slipped into Hawthorne's stall with a fresh bucket of warm mash. The horse didn't shy away. Instead, he lifted his head slightly, eyes meeting hers with a faint flicker, like a candle flame testing the air after a long darkness. Nora rested a hand on the side of his neck, feeling warmth she hadn't felt the day he arrived. His breathing steadied under her touch, and she felt an ache rise unexpectedly in her chest. Not sorrow, recognition. "You're still in there," she whispered, "and you're trying to come back, aren't you?" Hawthorne blinked slowly, and something fragile, something almost hopeful, passed between them. It wasn't a miracle, not yet. But it was the first glimmer, small, delicate, and real enough to make Nora believe that healing for both the horse and the people around him might no longer be a distant dream. Outside, the wind softened, brushing against the barn like a promise that change had already begun. The temperature dropped sharply the next day, leaving a thin crust of ice along the fence rails and sending curls of steam rising from the horse's breath. Nora arrived early with a stack of medical notes tucked beneath her arm, footsteps crisp on the barn aisle as she made her way toward Hawthorne's stall. The faint progress of the past 2 days had awakened something inside her. Hope, yes, but also a quiet urgency. A creature that broken didn't come back without revealing the story behind the wounds, and she intended to understand what had carved such emptiness into his eyes. Hawthorne stood still, though not with the rigid vacancy of before. His ears twitched toward her, acknowledging her presence. It was enough to make her pause. She eased the stall door open and began her assessment. Heart rate, hydration, lung clarity. The results were mixed. His lungs crackled faintly. His pulse raced faster than it should. Trauma, she knew, didn't just haunt the mind. It lived inside the body, tightening muscles, quickening breath, teaching the heart to expect danger even in silence. Reed appeared in the doorway, leaning on the frame, as if unsure whether to step closer. "Thought I'd help with morning checks," he said, though his tone made it clear he had been drawn here for reasons he didn't fully understand. Nora handed him a stethoscope, guiding him gently. "Listen along his ribs," she instructed. "Tell me what you hear." Reed crouched carefully, pressing the cold metal against Hawthorne's side. The horse shifted, not away, but ever so slightly toward him, steadying himself. Reed swallowed. "He's breathing hard," he said quietly, "like he's waiting for something to hit him." Nora nodded. "That's how shut-down animals breathe. It's survival, not fear." As she reached toward Hawthorne's face, intending to check his blink reflex again, something about his eyes stopped her. It wasn't their darkness. It was the way they flickered, not toward movement, but inward, like a person caught inside a memory they couldn't escape. She had seen that look before, in tents lit by generator lamps, where soldiers stared past her into some distant horror playing endlessly behind their eyes. For a moment her chest tightened with a familiar ache. Tessa entered carrying curry brushes, though her attempt at cheer faltered when she noticed Nora's expression. "He okay?" she asked gently. Nora hesitated. "He's remembering something, or caught in something." Tessa stepped forward and lowered her voice. "I know that look." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Her nightmares had the same glazed pull, the same distant ache. Nora reached out again, slowly, letting her fingers brush Hawthorne's cheek. His skin quivered beneath her touch. An involuntary tremor, but an unmistakable one. He blinked hard, once as if pushing away whatever was haunting him. Reed took a quiet step back, instinctively giving the horse space. Dillon arrived moments later with the vet, Dr. Harlan, whose calm presence filled the stall like a gentle weight. He examined Hawthorne with practiced hands, listening to his lungs, running fingers down his spine, checking old scars that hinted at the life he'd once lived. "He's been pushed far beyond his limit," Harlan said at last. "Training, maybe racing. But something broke him, mentally, not just physically." Nora's jaw tightened. "Do you think he was abandoned?" Harlan glanced at her, then at the horse's distant gaze. "Not abandoned at first. Horses don't develop trauma like this unless they once trusted the person who hurt them or left them behind." The words landed like cold stones in the stall. Reed looked down at the floor. Tessa braced herself against the wall, and Dillon's fingers curled subtly around the grip of his crutch. Each of them recognized that kind of betrayal, wounds inflicted not by enemies, but by life moments that should have held safety. As Harlan stepped back, Hawthorne lifted his head and, for the first time since arriving, met Nora's eyes with something more than emptiness. It wasn't clarity, not yet, but there was a flicker, small, fragile, and unbearably human, like the spark of a memory trying to rise to the surface. Nora inhaled slowly. "There's something inside him," she whispered. "Something he's trying to tell us," Reed nodded, gaze fixed on the horse. "Maybe he's waiting for the right moment." After the vet departed, Nora stayed behind, leaning her arms gently on the stall door. Hawthorne watched her, and she felt the weight of his gaze settle deep inside her ribs. Those eyes held a secret, something buried beneath exhaustion and silence, something that would eventually unravel the calm of their small ranch. She closed the barn lights at dusk, shadows stretching long across the aisle. Hawthorne remained still in the half-dark, but his eyes followed her until the door latched. For a long heartbeat she lingered, sensing the quiet shift in the air. A secret lived behind those dark, brimming eyes. And whatever it was, it hadn't been revealed yet, but it was coming. The sun rose warmer the following morning, melting thin sheets of ice that clung to the troughs and turning the ranch yard into a patchwork of soft mud and shimmering puddles. Nora stepped into the barn expecting the same stillness that had marked Hawthorne's early days. But something in the air felt different, a subtle hum, like the low vibration of hope easing through old beams and dust-filled rafters. She found the horse standing a little nearer to the front of his stall, his ears angled toward the aisle, as if drawn out of the shadows by the rhythm of footsteps and morning voices. It wasn't alertness. It was curiosity. Faint, wavering, but unmistakable. Reed was the first to approach him, carrying a bucket of warm mash. His posture was careful, respectful, yet something softer threaded through his movements. "Morning, Hawthorne," he murmured. When he set the bucket down, the horse lowered his head, hesitating for a long moment before taking a gentle mouthful. Reed blinked, stunned. "Well, look at that." It was the first time Hawthorne had eaten voluntarily since his arrival. A small thing, perhaps, but Reed felt it settle deep in his chest like a quiet victory he didn't know he needed. Nora watched from a few feet away, arms folded loosely, a slow smile spreading across her face. She stepped closer, letting the moment stay Reed's rather than intruding. Connection wasn't something that could be forced. It grew the way dawn did, quietly, then all at once. "He trusts you," she said softly. Reed shook his head as if denying it, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of pride he didn't know how to voice. Later that morning, Tessa arrived with grooming tools tucked under one arm. She hesitated at the stall door, glancing at Nora for reassurance. "Just go slow," Nora said. Tessa nodded, inhaling deeply before easing the curry comb toward Hawthorne's shoulder. At the first touch, the horse shuddered, his skin rippling like wind over tall grass. Tessa froze, ready to step back, but Hawthorne didn't pull away. Instead, he exhaled, a trembling breath that sounded almost like relief. Encouraged, Tessa brushed again, softer this time. Dust and old sweat lifted, drifting through a shaft of sunlight. Her hands steadied, the tremor that haunted her fingers dissolving into the motion. "You're doing great," Nora said. "No," Tessa whispered, brushing along the base of the horse's mane. "He's doing great. I'm just following his lead." By midday, even Dillon had been pulled into the quiet shift. He led Hawthorne out into the small fenced paddock for the first time, moving slowly on the uneven ground. The horse followed, mirroring Dillon's halting pace. When Dillon paused to adjust his grip on the crutch, Hawthorne stopped too, lowering his head as though waiting for him to regain balance. Dillon laughed softly, a loose, unguarded sound and the ranch hadn't heard from him in weeks. "You're watching out for me, huh?" The horse flicked his tail, breath puffing warm white clouds into the cool air, and for a moment Dillon felt less like a man struggling to stay upright and more like someone walking alongside a friend. Nora observed each interaction with a sense of awe she tried to keep grounded. Horses responded to emotion. That was the heart of equine therapy. But Hawthorne wasn't just responding, he was matching, adjusting, offering something that felt intentional. As she scribbled notes in her worn leather journal, she couldn't help adding the phrase emotional synchrony. It was rare and remarkable. That afternoon, clouds drifted in over the pasture, casting long shadows across the property. Nora returned to Hawthorne's stall with a fresh bale of hay. When she opened the door, he stepped toward her, tentatively but with unmistakable purpose. Her breath caught. She lifted her hand slowly, fingers grazing his cheek. His skin was warmer than it had been days ago, less brittle, more alive. His eyes still carried exhaustion, but the emptiness had begun to crack, letting in the smallest glints of light. "You're coming back," she whispered, piece by piece. The horse lowered his head until his muzzle brushed the sleeve of her jacket, an action so gentle she nearly missed it. Nora felt a lump rise in her throat. Outside, Reed and Dillon were tightening a loose plank in the paddock fence. Reed glanced toward the barn and saw Nora standing close enough to Hawthorne to feel his breath on her arm. "He picks who he trusts," Reed said, hammer pausing midair. "Yeah," Dillon answered, "and I think he's finally choosing us." As evening settled, a soft glow lit the barn aisles. The quiet was different now, not heavy, but peaceful, like a room that had begun to breathe again. Nora finished her rounds and paused at the stall one last time. Hawthorne lifted his head to meet her gaze. His eyes, once empty as dark wells, now held the faintest shimmer of recognition. When she closed the barn door behind her, it wasn't with the weight of worry, but with the gentle anticipation of tomorrow. Something had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Whatever secrets Hawthorne carried, whatever pain lay buried beneath his ribs, healing had begun to weave its way back into him, and into everyone who walked beside him. Snow clouds pressed low against the Wyoming sky. The morning the silver sedan rolled up Red Willow's gravel drive, unsettling the quiet rhythm the ranch had finally begun to find. Nora saw the vehicle from the barn window, a sleek, polished shape at odds with the battered trucks and dust-worn trailers that usually came through. Something instinctive tightened in her chest. People didn't drive cars like that out here unless they had something they intended to take. Reed was fixing a loose rail near the paddock when the car door opened. A man stepped out, tall and sharply dressed, though his posture sagged with the weight of sleepless nights. His eyes swept the ranch grounds with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort, as if this place, these patched fences, these healing souls, were foreign terrain. He approached the barn with footsteps that echoed just a bit too loudly, each one a declaration he didn't want to be here. Nora met him halfway, wiping hay dust from her hands. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man withdrew a thin envelope and offered it to her, his fingers trembling slightly. "My name is Miles Ashford," he said. "I believe you have my horse." For a moment the barn seemed to grow still. Even the horses shifted, sensing a change in air pressure. Nora opened the envelope, scanning the transport order inside. The name Hawthorne stared back at her. Her eyes lifted to Miles. "He was delivered here by mistake," she said carefully. "But he arrived in critical condition. We've been stabilizing him." Miles's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to question your care. I'm here because he shouldn't be here at all. He wasn't supposed to." His voice faltered, and he glanced away, blinking hard. Nora waited, sensing a story he wasn't ready to tell. Reed drifted closer, tension coiling through his shoulders. Dillon paused his walk across the lot, leaning on his crutch. Tessa stepped out from the tack room, eyes narrowing with caution. The ranch had learned to read intruders, people who came with demands, not understanding. But something about Miles was different. He wasn't angry. He was unraveling. "Before I can release him," Nora said gently, "I need to understand why he was transported in that condition." Miles exhaled sharply, as if the air had turned too thin for him. "Because I didn't look," he admitted. "I didn't want to look." He followed Nora into the barn, each step slower than the one before. When they reached Hawthorne's stall, the horse lifted his head. The faint light streaming through the high window brushed across his coat, illuminating the weary curve of his neck. For a moment the world seemed to suspend itself, Nora watching Miles, Miles watching Hawthorne, and Hawthorne staring at something only he recognized. Then Hawthorne took a step toward the front of the stall. His ears inched forward, his nostrils flaring with a soft, aching sound that prickled the air. Miles froze. His breath hitched, eyes glassing over. "I thought he wouldn't remember me," he whispered. The man moved closer, fingers trembling as he rested them against the stall door. "He belonged to my daughter," he said. "She was 15. She trained him herself, loved him more than anything." A sharp swallow cut off his words. "After the accident, I couldn't bear the sight of anything that reminded me of her. So I sent him away. Told myself it was practical, humane." Reed's hands curled into fists, empathy flaring like an old wound splitting open. Tessa's gaze softened, understanding too well the strange ways grief rewires a life. Dylan lowered his head, remembering a brother he'd buried too young. Miles inhaled shakily. "But she trusted him," he continued. "Believed he had more heart than any horse she'd ever trained. And I abandoned him." The confession hung heavy in the barn, settling into the cracks of old wood and the quiet spaces between breaths. Nora stepped closer, her voice gentle. Hawthorne didn't break because he was weak. He broke because he lost the person who tethered him. Miles's eyes flooded. For a heartbeat, he seemed smaller, stripped of the polished armor he'd worn into the ranch. He pressed a hand to his chest, directly above the place where the horse watched him with unwavering stillness. "I thought sending him away would help me forget," he whispered. "But grief doesn't work like that. It follows you. It waits." Then Hawthorne did something that stole the breath from every person in the barn. He stepped forward, one trembling, deliberate step, and lowered his head until his forehead rested lightly against Miles's sternum. A soft, broken sound escaped Miles, part sob, part relief. He reached up with both hands, clutching the horse's mane, as though anchoring himself to something real for the first time in months. Nora felt her throat tighten. Reed turned away to blink back tears. Tessa pressed a hand to her lips. Dylan exhaled slowly, eyes shining. In that fragile moment, Nora knew nothing about this encounter was coincidence. Hawthorne had not stumbled into their ranch by chance. He had been delivered to the one place where broken things learned to breathe again. And now, Miles was part of that circle too, another soul standing on the fault line between loss and healing. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the practical reality of transport orders and legalities. Miles stepped back, wiping his eyes. "I came here to take him home," he said hoarsely. "But now, I don't know what's right." Hawthorne lifted his head, eyes softening in a way Nora had not seen before, not empty, not haunted, but quietly aware. Watching Miles, choosing him, remembering him. Outside, wind stirred through the trees, scattering loose snow across the pasture like a whisper of everything still left unsaid. The storm announced itself long before the first flake touched the ground. It began as a pressure shift, a tightening in the cold Wyoming air that made the horses restless and sent a thin shiver through the chimes hanging outside the tack room. By mid-afternoon, clouds had gathered across the horizon in thick, bruised layers, rolling slowly toward Red Willow Ranch, like something with intention. Nora sensed the coming trouble before the alert sounded on her phone. Winter storms in the basin could be brutal, fast, disorienting, and unforgiving. But somehow this one felt heavier, as if it carried more than wind and snow. She stepped out of the barn, scanning the sky. A low rumble traveled along the foothills, not thunder, but the distant groan of wind shifting into a dangerous pitch. Snowbirds scattered from the fence line, their flight sharp and erratic. Nora pulled her jacket tight and walked toward the paddock where Reed and Dylan were securing loose boards. "We need to get everything locked down," she called. "The storm's moving faster than expected." Reed wiped his brow with the back of his glove, though the air was frigid enough to sting exposed skin. "How bad?" "Bad enough," Nora answered. She didn't elaborate. Reed had lived through enough chaos to read the tension in her voice. Tessa emerged from the main house carrying 2 weatherproof lanterns. The wind caught her hair, pushing it across her face in unruly strands. She glanced upward, eyes narrowing as the first flakes drifted down, slow, deliberate, like scouts testing the ground ahead. "Forecast said gusts up to 60 miles an hour," she said, "and visibility close to 0 by nightfall." Nora nodded. "Let's move." They worked with a practiced urgency, securing tarps, double-checking gate latches, and spreading extra bedding in the stalls. The ranch seemed to creak under the weight of gathering wind, the barns groaning as if remembering all the storms they had endured. But inside Hawthorne's stall, a different kind of tension simmered. The horse paced slowly, muscles twitching beneath his coat. His breaths came shallow and uneven. He jerked his head at every groan of the rafters. Nora stepped inside, heart tightening at the sight. "Easy," she murmured, placing a steady hand along his neck. But Hawthorne's skin quivered beneath her touch. He lifted his head toward the window where the wind had begun to whistle through the narrow seam. In his eyes, Nora saw something she hadn't seen since the day he arrived, a flicker of panic rising from a place too deep to soothe. Reed appeared at the door. "He senses it, doesn't he?" "More than that," Nora replied. "It's triggering something." A heavy gust slammed against the side of the barn, rattling the metal siding. Hawthorne flinched violently, backing into the corner. Nora's hand hovered. Helplessly. Reed stepped closer but kept careful distance. Hawthorne's fear was sharp enough to spread like electricity. Tessa joined them, lantern swinging lightly in her grip. "Storm anxiety?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Trauma didn't wait for permission. It resurfaced wherever echoes of the past were loudest. As the wind intensified, the horses in the adjacent stalls grew restless, stamping and snorting. The barn filled with unease, the kind that seeped into bones and stirred old memories. Dillon limped in, bracing himself against the doorway. "Generators ready," he said breathlessly. "But the gusts are getting stronger. We should stay inside once the sun drops." Nora nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on Hawthorne. The horse's pupils were blown wide, his breaths coming in rapid bursts. A sound outside, a metallic clang, made him rear slightly, hooves scraping the wooden floor. Nora lifted her hands to steady him, but stopped short, knowing any misstep could shatter what fragile trust he'd built. "We should leave him to settle," Dillon suggested. "No," Reed murmured, sensing something deeper. "He's not just scared. He's remembering something. Same way I do when thunder hits wrong." His eyes darkened with empathy, old shadows flickering behind them. Before Nora could respond, a sudden crack split the air. A loose sheet of tin on the far barn wall slammed repeatedly in the wind, each impact sharper than the last. The horses whinnied in fright, the barn erupting with nervous energy. Hawthorne spun abruptly, muscles coiling with a force that startled all of them. His eyes showed the whites, wide, terrified, wild. "Easy," Nora shouted, but her voice couldn't reach him now. He was somewhere else, some moment long buried but violently resurrected by the storm's fury. A final gust slammed into the barn with explosive force. The tin sheet tore free and hit the ground with a metallic shriek. That was the moment Hawthorne broke. He lunged forward, striking the stall door. The latch, old and weakened from seasons of strain, snapped open. The door flew wide. "Hawthorne!" Reed yelled, but the horse was already through, bolting down the aisle, hooves thundering like war drums. Nora lunged after him, but the swirling wind and chaos slowed her steps. The barn door swung open just enough for Hawthorne to shove through before the wind caught it and slammed it back against the frame. In an instant, the storm swallowed him whole. Reed froze, breath slicing through him like glass. The sound of the wind, a hollow, rising howl, triggered something old and buried. His vision swam as the barn flickered into a blurred overlap of past and present. Heavy air, screams muted by distance, static ringing in his ears. He staggered backward, gripping the edge of a stall to stay upright. Nora reached him, gripping his arm. "Reed, breathe, stay with me." But Reed's eyes were locked on the door on the place Hawthorne had vanished. "He's out there," Reed whispered, voice cracking. "Alone." And before Nora could stop him, Reed pushed past her and ran into the storm after the horse. The storm swallowed Reed the moment he stepped beyond the barn's threshold. Snow surged sideways in violent sheets, erasing distance and direction as if the world had shrunk to a whirlwind of white. The cold hit him like a wall, sharp enough to bite through his jacket and seize his lungs. But he kept running, boots slipping across the frozen earth, heart pounding in frantic rhythm. Somewhere ahead, Hawthorne was out there, panicked, wounded, and alone in a storm that showed no mercy. Reed didn't think. Instinct pulled him forward, the same instinct that once pushed him through dust and chaos on foreign soil. Behind him, Nora shouted his name, her voice carried away by the wind. She reached the doorway just in time to see Reed's silhouette vanish into the storm, swallowed by the blinding white. Panic gripped her chest. Tessa and Dylan rushed to her side, their faces tight with fear. "We can't chase them blindly," Nora said, forcing calm into her voice. "We'll get turned around in minutes." But even as she said it, she felt the pull to go after them, the same pull Reed had followed without hesitation. Reed fought his way toward the paddock, using the faint outline of the fence to guide him. The storm distorted sound, but he thought he heard hooves striking frozen ground somewhere ahead. A frantic, uneven rhythm swallowed by the blizzard. "Hawthorne!" Reed yelled, though the wind stole his voice. His breath came in ragged bursts, fogging instantly. A memory flashed, dust storms overseas, men shouting through chaos, the sickening weight of losing track of someone you're responsible for. His pulse spiked. The storm wasn't just weather. It was a doorway back into everything he'd spent years trying to outrun. A dark shape flickered at the far end of the paddock, barely visible through the swirling white. Reed stumbled toward it. His foot caught on uneven ground, sending him to one knee. The cold shot up his leg, numbing bone and muscle. He forced himself up again, teeth clenched. "Hawthorne!" he called once more. The shape shifted, hesitated, and then vanished beyond the broken section of fencing. Reed followed. The storm thickened as he crossed into the open field. Snow whipped against his face, stinging his skin raw. Each breath burned, each step grew heavier. His mind blurred, confusion creeping in as direction and memory tangled. The sound of wind roared in his ears, morphing into echoes of explosions and radio static. His heart hammered painfully, faster than it should. He was slipping, into the storm, into the past. A flash of movement to his right pulled him back. Hawthorne stumbled across the field, his coat whitened by snow, head tossing in desperate confusion. Reed's chest tightened. "Hey!" he shouted, though his voice cracked. "I'm here!" Hawthorne froze, ears flicking toward the sound. But another violent gust hit them both, and Reed felt his knees buckle. He dropped to the ground, the world tilting as the storm closed in around him. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. Panic constricted his chest, stealing air. "Not now," he whispered, though he wasn't sure whether he meant the storm or the memories. Hawthorne turned, breath steaming in the frigid air. For a moment, he simply stared at Reed, wide-eyed, shaking. Snow clung to his coat, gathering along his mane. Something flickered in the horse's gaze. Recognition, fear, and something deeper. Slowly he began to step toward Reed. One step, then another. His hooves crunched through the packed snow as he closed the distance. Reed pressed his hands into the ground, trying to rise, but the dizziness pulled him back down. He curled forward, breath shallow, fighting the spiral tightening in his chest. Then warmth touched his shoulder. A gentle pressure, steady and grounding. Hawthorne had reached him. The horse lowered his head, pressing it against Reed's back with a trembling urgency. His body shielded Reed from the wind, forming a barrier against the storm's wrath. Reed let out a sob he didn't realize he'd been holding. He gripped Hawthorne's mane, fingers clinging to the one solid thing in the world. "It's okay," he whispered hoarsely. "It's okay. I'm right here." Whether he was speaking to the horse or to himself, he didn't know. Back at the ranch, Nora gathered supplies, blankets, lanterns, rope, and prepared to go after them. Tessa insisted on coming. Dylan followed without question despite the strain in his leg. The storm fought them with each step, but they pushed forward, calling Reed's name into the wind. Nora spotted them first. Two shapes huddled in a shallow dip of land, Reed kneeling in the snow, Hawthorne standing guard over him like a sentinel carved from winter. Relief crashed through her so sharply she nearly stumbled. "Reed!" she shouted. He lifted his head weakly. Hawthorne turned, ears flicking toward the familiar voices. They reached the pair with lanterns glowing like soft orbs in the blizzard. Nora knelt beside Reed, pressing a hand to his back. "I've got you," she said gently. Dylan steadied Hawthorne, running a soothing hand down his neck. Tessa draped a blanket around Reed's shoulders, murmuring to keep him present, to keep him here. Slowly, with teamwork born from shared scars, they guided both man and horse back through the storm. Hawthorne stayed pressed close to Reed the entire way, matching each unsteady step with a protective calm that defied the chaos around them. By the time they reached the barn, Nora's hands were numb, her breath ragged. But they were together, safe. The storm still raged outside, but a quiet warmth settled inside the stall as they helped Reed sit on a stack of hay bales. Hawthorne stood beside him, lowering his head until it rested gently against Reed's shoulder. Reed closed his eyes. "He came back for me," he whispered. Nora touched Hawthorne's neck, her own heart swelling. "Maybe he knows what it feels like," she said softly, "to be lost in a storm and need someone to find you." Outside, the wind howled, but inside the barn, something had shifted. Something raw and unspoken had broken open, revealing the fragile threads that tethered them all. By morning, the storm had calmed into a deceptive stillness. The world outside lay buried beneath drifts of snow, sculpted by night winds, glittering faintly beneath a muted winter sun. Inside the barn, warm lantern light cast soft halos over Hawthorne and Reed, who remained close even after the chaos had passed. Reed sat wrapped in blankets, fatigue pulling at his features, but his breathing was steady. Hawthorne stood beside him like a watchful guardian, his flank rising and falling in quiet rhythm. Their shared exhaustion seemed almost sacred, like a vow forged under circumstances neither could yet fully understand. Nora moved gently around them, checking Reed's vitals while Dylan prepared warm water for the shivering horse. Tessa knelt nearby, rubbing life back into her hands after hours battling the cold. For a moment, the barn felt like a sanctuary suspended from time. Yet beneath the peace, something simmered, a sense that the storm had revealed not just fear, but truth. When the main door creaked open, all eyes turned. Miles Ashford stepped inside hesitantly, brushing snow from his coat. He looked as though he'd been awake the entire night, pacing, worrying, punishing himself for everything he couldn't undo. His gaze landed on Hawthorne first, then on Reed, pale but recovering. "Is he—" Miles's voice strained with dread. "Are you all right?" Reed nodded slowly. "We made it back." Miles exhaled, shoulders sinking with relief. Then he stepped toward Hawthorne. The horse lifted his head, ears pricking as if recognizing a familiar grief. Miles reached out, stopping short of touching him. "I heard what happened," he whispered. "They told me he ran out into that storm." Nora exchanged a glance with Tessa. "He panicked," she said gently. "Something in the storm triggered an old memory." Miles nodded stiffly, eyes wet. "He used to be fearless," he murmured. "My daughter used to say he ran like the wind was his friend." Reed shifted slightly, drawing Miles's attention. "He didn't run from me," Reed said softly. "He ran back." The words seemed to strike Miles like a physical blow. His hands trembled at his sides. "He came back." "To you?" Reed nodded. "When I fell, he turned around, stood over me until they found us." For a long moment Miles said nothing. Emotion trembled along his jawline. His gaze drifted slowly across the barn, to Nora, to Tessa, to Dylan, and the truth began, stitching itself together in his eyes. Hawthorne wasn't simply surviving here. He was healing, and he was healing others in ways no program or therapist had managed to reach. "What did you do to him?" Miles asked, though the question held no accusation, only wonder. Nora shook her head. "Nothing he didn't allow. He's been choosing us, one moment at a time." Miles looked at Hawthorne again, the horse's breath fogging lightly in the cold air. "I thought losing my daughter broke him," he whispered. "But maybe it broke us both." His voice cracked. "And maybe he came here because I couldn't give him what he needed anymore." Tessa stepped forward gently. "He's helping people here," she said, "more than you realize." Dylan added, "He matched my steps yesterday, kept me steady when my leg gave out." Reed met Miles's gaze with raw honesty. "He sees through the things we try to hide." Miles looked overwhelmed, absorbing the weight of what had been said. "All this time," he murmured, "I thought sending him away would help me forget, but it didn't. It only broke him further." Hawthorne lowered his head, pressing his muzzle lightly against Miles's shoulder. The man's breath caught, and a soft sound escaped him, a mixture of sorrow and awe. He raised a shaking hand to rest it against the horse's neck, fingers brushing the tender place where a halter had once rubbed too tightly. Nora watched carefully. This was the moment she hadn't anticipated, a shift not in the horse but in the man who once abandoned him. Hawthorne, for reasons he alone seemed to understand, had chosen forgiveness first. Miles drew a trembling breath and turned toward the small circle of veterans. "I came here to take him back," he said quietly. "But it's clear he belongs somewhere he's needed, somewhere he can heal, and help others heal." No one spoke. Snow slid gently from the barn roof, punctuating the silence. "I won't remove him from this place," Miles continued. "Not now. Maybe not ever." He swallowed hard. "If you'll let me, I'd like to help support his care. And your program." Nora blinked, stunned. Reed's expression softened into something like gratitude. Tessa let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Dylan nodded, eyes bright. But it was Hawthorne who delivered the final word, not in speech, but in gesture. He stepped closer to Reed once more, brushing his face against the man's chest, reaffirming the bond the storm had revealed. Then he turned back to Miles, touching his shoulder gently, offering a bridge across grief instead of punishment. Miles closed his eyes and let the touch stay. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to the horse, to Reed, or to the daughter he still mourned. In that moment, all of them realized something that felt bigger than the storm, bigger than the ranch, bigger than their separate histories. Hawthorne hadn't been delivered to the wrong place. He had been delivered to the only place he could have found them, and the only place where they could have found each other. Outside, the sun pressed through the thinning clouds, lighting the snow in muted gold. Inside the barn, something long frozen began, at last, to thaw. The storm had passed, but its imprint lingered in the softened drifts of snow and in the hush that settled over Red Willow Ranch the following days. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty but full of breath, of recovery, of the slow, deliberate mending that happened after people faced something bigger than themselves. Nora walked the barn aisle each morning with a renewed sense of purpose, feeling the subtle shift in the air every time Hawthorne lifted his head at the sound of her steps. His eyes, once hollow and unreachable, now carried a depth that reflected not just survival, but recognition and gratitude. Reed recovered quickly, though he insisted he was fine long before Nora agreed to let him resume chores. There was something steadier in him now, a softness in the way he moved around the horses, and an ease in the way he breathed when he entered the barn. Sometimes he found himself standing beside Hawthorne without meaning to, just resting a hand on the horse's neck as if grounding himself in the warmth there. Hawthorne always leaned lightly into the touch, as though acknowledging a shared understanding they no longer needed words or storms to find. Tessa, too, seemed changed. The tremors in her hands, once triggered by the smallest reminder of helicopter blades, had all but disappeared during grooming sessions. She brushed Hawthorne's coat with a calm, rhythmic motion, humming under her breath, her face relaxed in a way Nora had not seen before. Dylan walked more confidently with Hawthorne at his side, marveling at how the horse matched his pace without crowding him or lagging behind. "He's an anchor," Dylan said once, smiling. "He keeps me balanced, even when I'm sure I'm about to fall." Miles returned often in the days after the storm, not out of obligation, Nora realized, but out of a yearning to reclaim the parts of himself he'd abandoned along with Hawthorne. At first, he kept his distance, watching quietly as the veterans worked with the horse. But slowly he allowed himself moments, brief, careful touches to Hawthorne's muzzle, whispered apologies into the horse's mane, steps taken around the ranch with shoulders not quite as heavy. Grief had carved deep ravines inside him, but Hawthorne seemed to fill them with something gentler, a reminder of love not lost but transformed. One evening, under a sky streaked with lavender and fading gold, Miles approached Nora with a folder tucked under his arm. "I want to make it official," he said, voice steady but soft. Inside were transfer of ownership documents, signed and notarized. But behind them was something unexpected: paperwork establishing a fund dedicated to supporting equine therapy for veterans at Red Willow Ranch. "It's what she would have wanted," Miles said when Nora looked up, eyes wide. "My daughter believed Hawthorne could help people. I didn't see it then, but I see it now." Nora swallowed hard, emotion tightening her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. It felt too small for what he was giving them, for what he was restoring in himself. Miles shook his head gently. "No, thank you. You gave him back his life." His gaze drifted to the paddock, where Hawthorne stood silhouetted in the last light of day, tail flicking lazily as Reed secured the gate. "And maybe," he added quietly, "you gave me back mine." Weeks passed, and the ranch settled into a rhythm shaped by healing. Veterans came and went, some staying for sessions, others lingering longer to help with chores or walk the trails that wound through the snowy hills. Word spread quietly, stories of a horse who somehow sensed what people needed before they found the words, stories of calm settling over those who touched him, stories of broken pieces aligning slowly, miraculously, in his presence. Nora never advertised. She didn't need to. Hope had its own way of traveling. Spring arrived gradually, melting the last of the storm's remnants into soft earth. Birds returned to the fence posts. The wind, once sharp and punishing, carried hints of thawing pine and new grass. On a rare warm afternoon, Nora walked with Hawthorne along the trail behind the barn. The landscape had shifted from white to muted greens, dotted with the first stubborn shoots of wildflowers. Hawthorne's coat gleamed in the sun, healthier and fuller than the day he arrived. His steps were confident now, his ears forward, alert yet peaceful. They reached the newly placed wooden sign at the crest of the trail. The letters carved into it were simple, unadorned, but carried all the weight of the journey they'd lived. Hawthorne's Crossing, where lost souls find their way back. Nora rested a hand on the horse's shoulder, feeling the slow, steady rise of his breath beneath her palm. Reed had carved the sign. Tessa had sanded it smooth. Dylan had painted the letters black so they would stand bold against the wood. Miles had stood with them all as they placed it into the earth. It was more than a marker. It was a truth. Hawthorne flicked an ear as if listening to something distant, then nudged Nora gently with his muzzle. She smiled. "You weren't delivered to the wrong ranch," she murmured. The breeze carried her words softly through the pines. "You were delivered home." Hawthorne lifted his head, gazing out across the quiet fields that had once been cloaked in blizzard. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow across his face. For the first time since his arrival, he looked not like a survivor, but like a guardian, steady, whole, and standing exactly where he belonged. At Red Willow Ranch, healing no longer felt like a distant hope or an impossible dream. It lived in the rhythm of hooves on soft earth, in the laughter that drifted from the paddock, in the quiet moments shared in the barn. It lived in the hearts of those who stayed, of those who returned, and of those who found their way back through storms, physical or otherwise. And it lived most profoundly in Hawthorne, the horse who had once been lost and broken, but who now carried the light of many lives within him. He was home. They all were. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share a simple comment below and let me know which moment stayed with you the most. And if you'd like to join us for more true, heartfelt stories like this one, be sure to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and I can't wait to share the next one with you.